The Biden administration is working to find housing for thousands of migrant children who have entered the U.S. at the southern border. Right now, many are being placed into overcrowded facilities. These detention centers reportedly do not have enough resources to provide proper access to food, beds, and good hygiene. Mireya Villarreal reports from Mission, Texas.
Children, young and alone. The pace of unaccompanied minors illegally crossing into the U.S. is now being treated as a humanitarian crisis. Tonight, more than 4,000 children are in custody at overcrowded processing facilities, a 30% surge in the last week.
Those Border Patrol stations and facilities are not intended for the care of children.
To relieve the overflow, this Dallas Convention Center will be used as a facility to hold up to 3,000 teenage boys. Many families are being falsely told the border is open. The Biden administration is also no longer using the Trump-era policy of expelling migrant children because of health concerns created by the pandemic. New temporary processing facilities like this one in Donna, Texas are opening. Children interviewed by Neha Desai, a lawyer representing migrant youth, say they were hungry, some only showering once in 7 days. Desai telling CBS News conditions were so overcrowded that they had to take turns sleeping on the floor. The Biden administration is now turning to FEMA for assistance with increasing logistical challenges for shelter and processing. Today, House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy led a GOP delegation touring the El Paso border.
The sad part about all of this, it didn't have to happen. There's no other way to claim it than a Biden border crisis.
Heartbreaking. It's a very emotional issue for a lot of people.
White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki addressing the emergency.
The options here are send the kids back on the journey, send them to unvetted homes, or work to expedite moving them into shelters. That's exactly what we're focused on doing.
There are about 3,000 unaccompanied minors being held in a federal facility right now, and they are being held longer than that 3-day period. Border Patrol has this facility that's about a mile down the road from here, and local law enforcement is telling me still this is a hot spot. Mexico is right over my shoulder, and they are saying they are seeing hundreds of people cross through this area illegally every day without an end in sight. Elaine?
Mireya Villarreal, thank you. For more on this, let's bring in CBS News immigration reporter Camilo Montoya-Galvez. Camilo, good to see you again. What is contributing to this rapid influx of unaccompanied minors?
Good evening, Elaine. That is such an important question that is often overlooked. For context, it is important to note, Elaine, that the vast majority of these children and teenagers entering U.S. border custody are coming from Central America's Northern Triangle, which is comprised of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. Many of these children leave poverty-stricken areas of the region, including Guatemala's Western Highlands. Some of these children flee gang threats that, some of these gangs try to recruit them and force them to partake in criminal activity. For some teenagers, coming here to the U.S. and working here is the only way to lift their families back home out of poverty. And so there are a lot of factors that we have to consider. In addition, the region is still recovering from 2 devastating hurricanes last year. And when it comes to policy, because the reasons I just mentioned, we can call them push factors, there are also what some experts say are pull factors. One of them, I believe, is that the Biden administration has now decided to not reinstate the Trump-era policy of expelling these children without a court hearing, without an asylum interview, without a chance to continue their immigration proceedings here, and instead is transferring them, as required by anti-trafficking law, to the U.S. Refugee Agency. And that is the crux of the issue right now, because this refugee agency, Elaine, is running out of beds, and these kids, a lot of them, are now stuck in Border Patrol facilities which are not designed to house them.
Yeah, as we saw in Mireya's piece, the Biden administration is turning to FEMA. How else is it trying to alleviate the situation?
Sure. So just yesterday, Elaine, the Department of Health and Human Services, which oversees the U.S. Refugee Agency, announced it had opened an additional influx shelter in West Texas to accommodate this increasing number of unaccompanied minors entering U.S. border custody. This is in addition to another influx shelter that the administration already opened last month in Carrizo Springs, Texas. Also, we know now that the administration is planning on using a convention center in Dallas, Texas, to house up to 3,000 immigrant teenagers. That's how dire the situation now is in terms of the bed space. The administration is looking at a federal airfield in Northern California and a military installation in Virginia to also house some of these minors, because they believe that although these facilities may not be ideal to house children, they are much better settings than Border Patrol facilities, most of which were designed to detain adult men for short periods of time. And now we know, because of our reporting, that more than 4,000 children, Elaine, are stuck in these Border Patrol facilities, and many have reported going days without a shower, being hungry, sleeping on the floor, taking turns to sleep on the floor because of the lack of space, not being able to call family members outside of the facility. And one child, according to a lawyer that interviewed them, said that he had not seen the sun in 6 days while in Border Patrol custody. So that is the biggest concern now, Elaine, the conditions inside these Border Patrol facilities and the lack of shelter bed space.
It's just heartbreaking to hear these stories, Camilo. Why do some Republicans blame President Biden for the crisis?
Well, as you noted, Republicans have criticized the way the Biden administration has handled this. It has accused the administration of undertaking a, quote, open borders policy. But it is important, Elaine, to note that although the administration is in fact allowing these children to make a case for asylum here and is transferring them to the U.S. Refugee Agency, unlike the Trump administration, it is still expelling most migrant adults to Mexico or their home countries, as well as some families. So they are still applying a public health authority invoked by the Trump administration last March to expel most border crossers from U.S. soil. So that is important to note. But obviously, there is this policy change in terms of unaccompanied minors, and Republicans are saying that this is one of the reasons that so many children are coming now.
And Camilo, what happens to these children after they are put into shelters? What type of conditions are they living in? You mentioned some of the overcrowded conditions, but, there was a thought that there would be some services provided under the Biden administration that would help address, for instance, mental health or other kinds of issues that these migrants might be facing.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So for context, when unaccompanied children are apprehended by U.S. Border Patrol, they are supposed to be transferred to the U.S. Refugee Agency within 3 days, 72 hours. Obviously, that is not happening right now because of the lack of bed space, but that's the law. While in the custody of the Refugee Agency, they have access to lawyers, child advocates, social services, vaccination, medical services, and other accommodations specifically designed for children, and they are housed, most of them at least, in shelters that are licensed by states to care for children. So these facilities are nothing like Border Patrol facilities. And this refugee agency, after taking these kids into custody, is legally obligated to release them from custody to sponsors who are typically family members. And this is because there is an agreement that detention and government custody is never in the best interest of children. So the refugee agency in recent weeks, Elaine, has increased sharply its discharge rate. It is releasing hundreds of kids per week. But the problem is, Elaine, that it is getting a lot more new children than those who are leaving its custody.
Well, Camilo, this week the House is expected to vote on 2 immigration bills, including President Biden's American Dream and Promise Act. What can you tell us about these pieces of legislation?
Sure. So as you may remember, earlier this year, the Biden administration and congressional Democrats unveiled this sweeping proposal to revamp U.S. immigration law. The centerpiece of the plan would place the approximately 11 million undocumented immigrants here in the U.S. on a pathway to U.S. citizenship. Dreamers, temporary protected status holders, and farm workers would have an expedited path towards legalization. However, as written, that plan is unlikely to garner Republican support because it lacks, for example, some of the border security measures that have been seen as key to getting Republicans on board. But congressional Democrats are now adopting a new strategy of trying to pass two separate standalone bills to address specific issues. One of them would place DACA recipients, young immigrants who came to the U.S. as children, and temporary protected status holders on a pathway to U.S. citizenship, and another bill would place hundreds of thousands of undocumented farm workers on another pathway to U.S. citizenship. And the reason they're doing this, Elaine, is because those bills actually do, in fact, have bipartisan support, which is required in the evenly split Senate because of the filibuster rules.
All right, a lot of developments ongoing. Camilo Montoya-Galvez. Camilo, thank you very much.
Thanks, Elaine.